Mr. Rose. I think since we live together, we can take our masks off.
That's the nicest thing you said to me all day.
We'll try to make that a pattern. Since we have people out there in cyberspace joining us for tea, I thought the first thing we needed to do was to have a little sip, and then maybe you can sing your tea song to us.
Well, I remember this tea song when we first talked about this event, and I remember it from the wall, and I'm not sure I've ever heard it since about 1945, but we looked it up, and sure enough, there it is, and it was sung by famous singers, but it was first in a show in 1937 in London, and it was very popular during the war. And here we'll just try a little of it. I like a nice cup of tea in the morning, for to start the day, you see, and at 11:30, well, my idea of heaven is a nice cup of tea. I like a nice cup of tea with my dinner, and a nice cup of tea with my tea. And when it's time for bed, there's a lot to be said for a nice cup of tea.
Thank you.
Not very good.
One of the things the Americans always have on their minds when they go to England is having a proper tea and trying to understand the role that tea has played and does play in the life of the English. So talk to us about England and tea.
Funnily enough, I was wanting to wear a t-shirt to this, and my first t-shirt goes back to 1989, Meredith Abroad, but we may come on to that later. Tea has been around in China since more than 2000 BC, and I'm not sure if we all knew that, and I'd forgotten it if I knew it. And there's no particular reason why we associate tea with England now, because there are so many other countries around the world that have tea. But I had the year written down, 2700 BC, a Chinese emperor had some boiling water and some leaves, this is the story, blew in, and he thought it tasted so good that he decided to keep having it. And what the emperor wanted to do, everybody else had to do. It became very, very fashionable. Then it spread to Europe. It was very, very highly taxed, and what you do know about tea is the Boston Tea Party, but it was taxed very highly everywhere. And I read that in England in the 19th century, a pound of tea would be a month's wages for a poor person. So it started as a sort of rich person's drink. And these are just examples. Every English family, I think, 19th century, a well-off family had a nice teapot, and that's a beautiful teapot.
Yes, it is.
And there was a little bit of ceremony to making the tea. You put in the
Part
tea.
of John's dowry.
You heated the pot first, and then you put in the tea leaves, then you poured in the tea. And then there was an argument whether you put in milk or whether you put tea first, and sugar if you had it. Nobody bothers about this anymore now. And we brought this just as another example of a 19th century thing, because you had to lock up these things from your servants. So you locked up your tea by putting it in a tea caddy, and you can still see them occasionally. But also you locked your decanters up in something called a tantalus, and that's where you had your whiskey and your brandy and other spirits, and they were locked in there so the servants couldn't get hold of it. I'm afraid I don't use it anymore. I can't find the key, but I wouldn't use it anyway, because my wife, of course, would not touch any of those things, and we don't have any servants apart from her. That's a joke.
I do want to point out that this tea comes from Betty's Tea Room, and the students who've gone to England with us have probably been to York and been to Betty's Tea Room, which is a very popular place. And one of the things they make for which they're very famous is a scone. It's called Betty's Fat Rascal. It's fair to say I've bought tea towels and tea cozies and aprons for Mr. Rose that to call him, dare I say it, Betty's Fat Rascal. I think a place to start, John, is to talk about how you first became connected with Meredith College, because I think a lot of people assume that that was through me, when in fact it was not.
I've always assumed that everybody at Meredith knows Dr. Webb because she's been around such a long time and she hasn't finished yet. And I also assumed that everybody would have known Roger Crook and his wife. He was the Meredith religion professor who's written a book on Thomas Meredith. And his wife Mary, among his many books, and his wife Mary Ruth. And they were the first people to arrange study abroad at Meredith, and that goes back a long, long way. I actually find all this such a long time ago, I had to write down one or two little dates. For instance, my t-shirt's only going back to 1989, but my first meeting with Meredith students was in 1976, on the 14th of July, when I first met Roger and Mary Ruth, and showed their students around Parliament in London. I'd worked in Parliament since 1958, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later. And I then showed groups of their students around every year, and he invited me as a visiting professor to Meredith in 1981. And there I wrote, quotes, "Grace at meals and no alcohol anywhere." I wrote in my diary on 22nd of August 1981, I met Dr. Webb for the first time, and she was head of the English department, in my opinion rather severe and lacking in humour. Little did I know her, though she can be severe, not fortunately too often. But she did invite me to a dinner party at her house, and I got to know her and lots of faculty when I was here for 8 weeks. That summer. We both recall, and this is my chance to tell the story and she cannot argue with us, an initial irritation with each other. Her version is slightly different from mine, but she took an instant dislike, I read, to my criticism of some of her students' writing, as well as to the clothes I wore on campus. For example, shorts and poor, non-existent colour coordination. So I think that's my introduction. I taught my Parliament classes in Rushlikon, Prague, San Sepolcro, and mostly, of course, in London for something getting on for 30 years, always very happy with lots of nice students from 1990 to 2008 and longer. And there are lots of students with whom we still have good relations and hear all the stories that we didn't hear at the time of all the things that they did.
Thankfully, didn't hear at the time.
So that's me at Meredith, and I became having been a visiting professor to start with, I became a faculty alum, but have not done a great deal of teaching, although my subject has very much expanded. Faculty... Adjunct faculty, sorry. Not very good on the terms. And so here we are.
It's very nice if you're director of international programs to live with someone from another country. There's always something to talk about. Sometimes quite surprising when you think you know everything. But one of the things we've been talking about a great deal since the pandemic is the fact that John grew up during the war, and he's been very concerned about how the youngsters are going to handle this pandemic, more concerned than I've been, because I think the pandemic, for Americans being a relatively minor thing compared to World War II in England, spending the nights in bomb shelters, hearing the sound of the bombs crashing down in the neighborhood, and carrying a gas mask everywhere you went. But obviously you got used to that, and you don't remember that as traumatizing. Tell them about your life during the war, including your evacuation.
I remember a good deal about the war. I was one of 4 children with 2 older sisters and a younger brother who was born 3 days after war was declared in 1939. I was 5. None of these things really meant anything to me. I didn't know what was going on. I don't think it was ever explained to any of us. I think we assumed that the English always fought the Germans, and I think I was used to everything being short and rationed. I remember in particular the butter ration, which was a slab, maybe it was a pound, and it was cut up into 6 pieces, and we each had our little flag in it. And I was always suspicious that my father got slightly more, but I'm not sure if he did. The car that we had was put up on bricks and not used for the rest of the war because there was no petrol, which you call gas, unless you were in a special occupation. My father was a lawyer in London, and he used to go out by train every day, or he went to a local office. And my mother must have had a very difficult time looking after 4 little children. And between 1939 and 1941, incidentally, you all know when the war was, don't you? And if you say 1941 or 1942 to 1945, I get very upset because it's 1939. And I remember the gas masks that we had to try on and keep at home. I'm not sure if we ever actually wore them. I remember what we called the doodlebugs and the V2 rockets. And we were evacuated because we lived south of London with my sister's school up to the north, and that was my only meeting really with people from the north who were very different, and meeting, dare I say it, of a slightly different class from me. They spoke differently, they did everything differently. My mother didn't want us eating her food, for instance. They wore clogs instead of shoes.
What did they eat?
They ate a lot of liver and onions and chips, but they were extremely
much poorer.
They were much poorer. This was a mining and cotton mill area north of Manchester, and I'm sorry we never kept up with them afterwards. I think I was very restricted in my childhood. I wasn't aware how privileged I was, but of course none of us were really very privileged during the war. My father, who had fought all through the First World War, went away for the Second World War, and I can remember that was the only time my mother cried that I can ever remember. But he was back again a couple of months later. He was over 50, and he managed to get relieved of his job in the army. Perhaps it's worth saying that, of course, 1945 was the end of the war, but rationing went on for a long, long time, through to the early 50s. And we British were very poor, and sort of financially we'd never recovered from that war. And I can remember at school, that would be 1947. I was quite keen on sweets. I'm not anymore. Little sweet bombs, what do you call them?
Sweets, candy.
And I used to buy other people's rations of sweets because they were still rationed. I remember the day they stopped rationing them. I couldn't understand a world where everything was totally free and easy and not rationed, and you could just go and buy anything you wanted. But of course, health-wise, I think it's interesting that our generations that were brought up when we couldn't eat and drink everything we wanted have turned out to be a lot more healthy than the younger generation now, dare I say.
One of the things I like in the Imperial War Museum is their domestic life exhibitions, and there's some very clever propagandistic posters, and I think you've got postcards. I think we'll have pictures of those. Can you remember any of those slogans that were designed to make you clean your plate?
Very definitely, yes. Waste the food and help the Hun. If you still know Hun as a German. And I took a big one of those to San Sepulchro, and I think we still got it there. Because I still get upset when all the students take huge quantities of food and then leave half of it. One other memory I wanted to mention was that we had an air raid shelter in our garden. But there were shelters that you could get. More primitive were ones you just put under the dining room table, bits of corrugated iron, arched. But slightly better than that was what we had, was a great big hole dug in the garden and an air raid shelter put in that with lots and lots of earth over it. And we must have had those ready in advance because we knew that these rockets were going to come on south of England. They were going to come from fairly close to the coast in Belgium and Holland and maybe in France, which was one reason why they were very keen to get on with D-Day to stop these things, because the Germans were good on rockets. Anyway, we had all these rockets, and our family of 5, my father refused to sleep in the shelter. We all went and slept in the shelter every single night, and it was a minute little place, and when the war was over, that's where we kept our apples. But I suppose we quite enjoyed it at the time, but it wasn't really much fun looking at it. And then every day, if you'd heard these rockets, and some of them had landed nearby, you could read or hear how the people had been killed and the houses had been bombed. Recall that we had only one television channel, if we had a television at all. We had a television till after the war. We just had one BBC channel, and we had the news, Pathé News I think it was, which you saw if you went to the cinema, which you called a cinema.
Yes, we probably call it movies, but
Movie
you
theatre.
know what cinema is. I think all of the people our age can remember hearing war news in the movie theater, but you also would have had a radio, right?
Yes, radio.
And kept that on all the time.
I think of 6 o'clock news and 9 o'clock news. I mean, you didn't have news all the time the way you can have it now.
Do you remember when we were in the Imperial War Museum and that school group of very young children came in and they were looking at the bomb shelter, and you said to them, I slept in one of those.
And they looked at me as though I was 100 years old.
That's right.
But in fact, the Second World War is a long time ago, because in the 30s and 40s, the First World War was only 20, 30 years before. And we still thought of it as a completely different era. So people now, below a certain age, think of the wars long since past.
Ancient history.
Ancient history.
I think something that people would find interesting, I certainly did, was the fact that you kept diaries and that your father kept diaries. So you have such a precise record of your family history. Your father would have started keeping diary when? What year would you guess?
I think around about 1900. I
Okay,
had
so
an old father.
that's 120 years of records.
Yeah.
And he kept his every day?
Yes, to be honest, they're pretty boring. The First World War that he fought in, I really ought to trace it all through with a map, but I never have. Most of his friends were killed. I think that affected him for the rest of his life. But he did write in it, and I think it may have been you who noticed that. Do you use the phrase "red letter day"?
Yes.
He wrote in red only once. Red letter day was the birth not of me, but of my brother in 1939. I've never been the slightest bit jealous of that, but I think he he was interested to have 2 sons as well as 2 daughters. I don't think he thought a great deal about politics or life in general. But those times were very, very hard because the First World War, his friends were killed. He marries late. The 1930s is a terrible, terrible economic time. And then comes the Second World War, which is awful for him, the young family.
Well, tell us about your own experience in the National Services, since we're talking about war and military. Tell them about your National Services.
Before I talk about schools,
Yes, I think so.
we had an OTC at school, an officer training corps. So I think we were particularly qualified to become officers. We had to do 2 years national service.
That was required of
That was
everybody.
required of everybody, only males. And I think I always assumed I was going to be an officer, but you actually had to pass an exam. And so I went to officer training school, which was very interesting, at Eton Hall, which was the stately pile of the Duke of Westminster, a huge, great place. And there we were shouted at just like the private soldiers, and the difference was that we, as the Sergeant Major said, were very fierce. We call you sir, and you call us sir, but you mean it. And we were a bit scared of them. And after that, I was told I would be serving in my father's old regiment, which was the King's Own Yorkshire Light Infantry. But sure enough, a few weeks later, which was incidentally in Germany, going to Kenya, to the Mau Mau, so that wouldn't have been a lot of fun. But typically of the army, a few weeks later, they said, change of plan, you're going to go to the West Indies with the Duke of Cornwall's Light Infantry. So that's what I did, and I went out with the troop ship, and we landed first in Bermuda, where we set off 100 of our men who were the first British soldiers there after the war. And then we went on to Jamaica, and then we went in a different boat to Belize, because we was the regiment of 600 people was split into 3 groups. And I was one of those. I have no idea how they chose who would go where. Went to Belize, British Honduras. So I was one of 6 officers, British officers in Central America. And that was really a fascinating experience. I had a motorbike, and I had a dugout canoe, and I used to go canoeing in the jungle. It was probably quite dangerous. There were lots of wild animals about.
I thought I remembered that you had a pet.
Yes, I had a pet tarantula, which lived on my mosquito netting, but my next door neighbour, who was the medical doctor, he had several parrots that lived on his, and they were far more messy. But we were all ordered to get rid of these. Septimus, my spider, was a beautiful hairy thing. Somewhere I've got a photograph of him. But he would only bite you if he got in a really bad mood, and he never did with me. But after that I went to Jamaica, which was still in the colony, with a British man in charge with a cocked hat. And that's where I could tell you about Princess Margaret if you wanted to hear about it.
It's rather scandalous, but I think probably
We can cut
need
it.
to tell it.
We can cut it out if there isn't time. It's a good story.
It's a good story.
I don't know if you all think of Princess Margaret as a young, beautiful lady, or as a much older lady, always perhaps rather difficult. Anyway, as a young lady, she was very, very pretty indeed, and in Jamaica, she was a sight for all our sore eyes, particularly us young officers. And the officers in Jamaica, of whom there were maybe 20, 30, because it was most of the battalion, thought they'd be very kind to the National Service officers, of whom there were maybe 20, and we had a mutual dislike of each other, because we were just temporary people there for 2 years, going on to lives completely different, and they were there permanently, and we always thought they were a bit stupid to compare with us, I'm sorry to say.
And what did they think about you all?
They thought we were young whippersnappers, if you have such a thing.
If anybody grew up looking at the cartoon Beetle Bailey, if you think of Lieutenant Fuzz and Sergeant Snorkel, I think that's the relationship he's talking about.
Anyway, they kindly agreed that they would allow 2 National Service officers to go to this great dinner, to which they were obviously all going to go themselves. And we weren't allowed to see the draw, but the 2 that were chosen were 2 of the smarter ones, I thought, of whom I happened to be one. So we go to this grand dinner in the Blue Mountain Inn, and Princess Margaret is surrounded by these elderly, on the whole elderly, rather boring people. And she spends her time looking at me, this is my story, saying, rescue me from these boring people. I want to spend the evening with you, have a dance with you, etc., etc. We never got close to each other. But next day I was summoned by the adjutant, who was the orderly. He was in charge of the discipline for the young ones, and told off in no uncertain manner. Tore off a strip, if you have that expression. And I'm sure I had to say I was very sorry. I was very lucky I didn't put on any extra duties.
And you were torn off a strip for what reason?
For staring.
Staring at her. Scandalous. I think maybe now something we could talk about is your education, because it's so fundamentally different from American education. And even your terms confuse us, and we're always trying to figure out how your universities work, how your education prior to university works. So when did you first go to a school?
I went to 6 different schools between 1939 and 1941, when I was just a little youngster.
2 years, 6 schools.
6 schools. We have 3 terms. I don't know if we're changing from 3 to 2. I think we still have 3. And they were just for little children. I don't think we learned very much, but we learned a bit. And then I went to what we call prep school, which is ages really about 7 to 13. And I think we have to talk in terms of money and class, and these were not free. So 90% of children did not go to these sort of schools. But I went to this prep school, and it was all male, and that was games and play and Latin and Greek and science, etc. And from there we took our exams to get to the public schools. Not everybody went on to the public schools, some went to the local grammar schools. Went to my father's old school, to Marlborough, which was one of the 19th century public schools. Some of them went back to the Middle Ages. But we were pretty smart. We used to have games with the schools you've heard of, more like Eton and Winchester. And in those days, huge numbers of our boys, we boys only went on to Oxford and Cambridge, which has changed completely now. There were no girls. Girls came in about 25 years ago and have been a huge success in their own right and for the schools, no doubt.
Would you like to name some of those girls who went to your old school?
Yes, my old school doesn't have to do any recruiting, whatever, because all the parents want to send their children there.
Oh, their daughters.
Because, yes, daughters. Because Princess Kate was there, but also the old Prime Minister's wife, Cameron, and the old Chancellor of the Exchequer's wife, and the Speaker's wife, and the Governor of the Bank of England's wife. And they were all in a very small number of girls who must have had just the right amount of bullying, I think, when they went there to stand up to these boys and to succeed. They were chosen very carefully. They've been hugely successful, that generation. Also the odd princess, like that one who got married the other day.
Most of those princesses are pretty nice. Can I say one thing?
Yes.
You identified those all as wives, but all of them had their own distinguished
Oh yes, they're distinguished, and probably they run their husbands the way various other people,
I should hope
run
so.
their husbands. We had beatings and we had runs, which we called sweats, but we were very, very well taught for exams and for university entrance. So it was Latin and Greek. I hardly learned any science in my life. The thing you wanted to do at school was to be a success on the sports field. I was quite good at hockey, and we were a very good hockey school in those days. And we had the corps, and I was a cadet captain. I was head of the military in the school, and the only other thing you could do if you didn't want to do that, you could go into some Air Force or naval unit, or you could go and help old ladies and play bridge with them, etc., which I think is what my son did in there, if you didn't want to have anything to do with the services. So that was Marlborough.
Tell them about the winter time.
Oh yes, each house, this is interesting, each house had its different traditions, though I think we were all pretty tough. But in our house they had things called vossings, and if you were punished by a house prefect, you could also be beaten by a prefect. I only once had the chance to beat anybody and didn't take it, which was very cowardly of me. We might have become great friends, you never know. Anyway, the vossing meant you had, at the first bell at 7 o'clock, some poor little boy had to count up the timings from 7 o'clock. You had, within 5 minutes, to have a cold bath, dress, tie your shoelaces, tie your tie, and appear in front of a prefect within 5 minutes. And if you were late, then you got more of these things, and if you were inefficient, you were doing them forever. And it was a very useful thing in later life. I can't do it in 5 minutes now.
And
the other thing was the snow on the bed. Yes, we had to have the windows open at night, which was probably a good idea because there was lots of sweat about. And certainly in the winter, sometimes we would wake up with snow on our beds, not melting. I can't remember how. I guess we just took off the top blanket and shook it outside. But on the whole, Marlborough days were happy days. And when I went up to Cambridge after the army, Cambridge was just full of Marlborougans in a way it wouldn't be now. There'd only be 10 or 20, but in those days there were 200 or 300. We didn't realise how privileged we were. We didn't realise how well life was on our side, and that we were much too lucky.
Okay, tell us about your Cambridge life.
It was fun. I used to say to the doctor that the main point of university is fun, getting to know other people, having a very good time, working quite hard, getting a degree, growing up. And I think she was a bit shocked because she thought it was all about learning.
Yes.
And that's one of the really interesting things right now. And I hope Meredith is doing well with it, and I hope all the universities are doing well with it. But if you can't keep meeting with your friends, that's what we were doing. We were meeting with our friends. Now, maybe you have better professors. You certainly have an internet. We spent most of the time learning from our friends, and much less interaction, I think, with the professors. They tended to be rather grand people, and they were interested in their own research. I think I've always said the teaching at Meredith is 10 times better than my teaching at university.
Would you repeat that?
Well, you know what I mean. I don't want to make you too proud of yourselves. But I'm serious. The relationships between the students and the professors are so much better nowadays than they were. We hardly knew our professors at all.
Something else Americans have never understood is your royal family and your willingness here in the 21st century to still have a queen while at the same time you are a democracy. How can you explain that to us?
With difficulty. it's all a matter of history. Countries have revolutions. You had one a long, long time ago. The Russians had one, lots of the French had one. We've never, the Spanish had one. Although they've got a king who's in a bit of trouble right now. Monarchy seems like an outdated thing. Thailand as well, having huge problems on them. Do you need a head of state who is separate from the head of government? You don't have one. The advantage of one is that you can split the job into two, and the head of state can do the ceremonial things, and the head of government can run the government. And that is the way historically we have done it. Of course, the kings and queens were the power. They were in charge of the courts, they were in charge of everything. Parliament sprang from the royal family. So here we are, 19th century, a royal family German that didn't speak English, and so you had to have ministers representing them and running the affairs. And so we move into the 20th century, and we move from an aristocracy ruling the House of Lords to a House of Commons elected democratically, more or less, we hope, and the Prime Minister who is the leader of the majority party in the House of Commons. And you can love your Queen, as we have a Queen now, in a way you don't have to love your Prime Minister. You can get rid of your Prime Minister every few years, or more often if you're lucky. But the Queen is there, and she can do no wrong. She can't even be taken to court, although her sister could be, I think, or her daughter could. The Queen, they are the Queen's court, so she can't be taken to court. And there is a sort of clash we have between us and you, because you're supposed to have a division between the three parts of the Constitution, and to what extent can the President interfere in what goes on in the courts, helping choose judges, etc., etc., and Congress, and can they be equal? Well, we've got only we have only a legislature and an executive, and the Queen is in charge of everything. But if she dared to interfere in anything, she wouldn't last very long. So she has to put up with whatever Prime Minister is foisted on her, although she might be nasty behind the scenes, we never know. And it so happens this Queen, it seems to me, has never ever done anything wrong. And I've always wondered how she sleeps at night. I think she just has learned not to worry about anything, just like let it all wash over her. Now when she dies, which may not be for a long time because she's only in her 90s and her mother lived to 101, she may live longer than Prince Charles, who's now 70s, I think. And he is not so popular for several reasons, I think, because he doesn't appear to be very humble, and he likes having his own servants and everything, as did the Queen Mother. And of course, then there's Lady Di and all that stuff, and Camilla. I think we've more or less got used to Camilla, but I don't think we want to have her as Queen. So a lot might depend on the next heir, and this happens to have worked quite well with Prince William as opposed to Prince Harry. If they'd been the other way round, it might have been a lot more difficult. And I'm intrigued how much the Americans are interested, the royal family, how interested they are in Harry. I hope it'll all turn out all right.
I think another thing that's interesting, because it is so different, and so, as you say, tied into history. We have a lot of things that are tied into history. We just don't have very long history in this country. Your job, you were wig-wearing clerk in the House of Commons. Tell us what that meant doing and why you got to wear that wig.
Nobody had ever heard of us, and nobody has heard of us still. We worked for Parliament, not for the government. So we could tell the Prime Minister what to do, just as we could any humble backbench MP, but we worked for the Parliament. And I never really heard of it. until I met somebody through an old friend, and he told me that he worked very hard when he worked, but he might get 3 months holiday a year in the summers. And it sounded an interesting job, so I went for it, and I had a good law degree, and I took the national exam, and I was one of 2 lucky people that year. We were a very small number of people in those days, about 50 of us, clerks with a capital C, and the theory was that we could read and write rather better than the members of parliament. And going back to the 14th century, you'd always had to have a clerk who was in charge of keeping all the records, and more or less, as time went on, helping all the MPs and arranging everything where they were sitting and the agendas. The department changed hugely while I was there, because we had very few committees, and we had to more or less vacate the building every year. A session was just one session. And so all the committees had to end, and then new ones had to start again. And I think the government liked it like this because it meant that the MPs couldn't cause too much trouble. But while I was there, we set up huge, not we, but the institution set up huge quantities of committees, select committees, and the number of staff has escalated to huge numbers. And you read about all the committees summoning people right, left, and centre. And I think about it in a way that the MPs take more and more interest in small things and less in big things, partly because of devolution to Scotland and Wales, so that they both have their own assemblies, stroke parliaments, but also to the European Union. And of course that's now coming to an end after 73, so that's whatever it is, 47 years. And I could speak about that for ages because it was a fascinating subject. But we had a strange relationship with the MPs because they could cause us a lot of trouble by going to the Speaker and saying this chap has been very unhelpful. But we could also go to the Speaker and say these are the rules and this is what you should do. The last Speaker was a very interesting character, some of you may know about, but we've now gone back to more traditional times. But I'd like to think that we're very much respected by the MPs and would be by the public if they knew what we actually did. But without us, the base, there's no doubt it couldn't function for 2 minutes because we're in charge of all the printing, agendas, papers, everything. And the building itself, which some of you may be aware is in a huge state of disrepair and is going to have to be vacated for some years, and that's a very major problem that's on the horizon. And that's mixed up with leaving the European Union, which means that Parliament will get back more of its powers that it had released to Europe.
And Webb?
I don't know when lawyers first started wigs. My understanding was that a wig was considered to be a good thing to wear to give you some air of authority and anonymity. And I must say, some of my colleagues, when I saw them in wigs, I didn't really recognise them. But we were only in wigs when we sat at the table of the House, not in the committees. But none of the committees could operate without one of us present. And in the days, fortunately, that still go when smoking was not allowed in committees, and I had a very distinguished chairman who said he was going to smoke in the committee. I went to my boss and said, what do I do if the chairman of this committee, who was a highly respected man, starts smoking? He said, you just leave the room and then the committee can't function.
Let's talk just a little bit about Brexit. I mean, we've agreed that getting into that is a 3-hour conversation, but I think probably some of you know John voted in favor of Brexit. I, who sadly don't have a vote in England, would have voted against it. I respect his reasons, I don't share them. I think he respects mine, he doesn't share them. Tell them about your earliest involvement, because you were with the European Union when it was the EEC and the EC and the EU, But even having been involved in setting it up, you were happy to leave it. And that probably would be an interesting thing to explain.
The EEC, European Economic Community, then European Community, then European Union, was always controversial. And the question was, to what extent would we give our sovereignty, such as it was, over to an international organisation where we would be just a minor partner with originally 6 and then now 27 other countries, with lots of different languages, different traditions, different laws, very complicated structure. And it was, as I say, it was always controversial, and I was involved in it from the beginning with a committee of very high-powered people. We went to Strasbourg and Brussels, and I remember, for instance, lovely lunches with Churchill's daughter and son-in-law, and he was then the ambassador, and then he was one of the 2 commissioners. But we were never totally happy. We nearly always found ourselves in a minority, sorry. And as soon as there was a really controversial issue, the question was whether you could have a veto. And the right of veto has been steadily diminished, which is good if you're going to have an organisation that gets on. Otherwise, out of 27 countries, there will always be one that wants to disagree. But we were finding ourselves more and more in the minority. We never had referenda in England. It wasn't part of our constitution. But we started them with Harold Wilson in relation to the European question, but also in relation to independence of Scotland and Wales. And so it became more traditional and an easy way for a government to get out of making a decision, say we'll have a referendum. And it was fought against in the cabinet and in Parliament for years by Cameron, but he finally gave in. Mr. Blair had the same fight with Mr. Brown, who succeeded him as Prime Minister. And I think I'm right in saying that Blair had been in favour of giving up and having a referendum, but Brown had stopped him. So they never had one until Cameron had one, for which he required a vote in Parliament and won, and had a lot of members of the other side voting for it as well. Because I think they all thought on both sides that the referendum would lose and that we would not leave. And then, to their huge surprise, we left.
Okay, something I want to know, because we talk about this a lot, but I think we sort of talk around it. What are your favorite places in the world? Places you love the most?
I think about the places I still want to go back to one more time or more. But it's a very difficult question because I've only got one wife, and she is my favourite wife. But I've got several places that are my favourite place, and if I'm allowed to have several, they are favourites because of the memories and because physically what is there now and of the people that are there. So I do actually have to put San Sepulchre up there. I definitely need to get back. Excuse me, to San Sepulchre for all sorts of reasons. There's another one in southern Switzerland, in the Ticino, it's the Italian part of Switzerland, called Cerentino. And I'd love to go back there again. It's so peaceful up in the hills and beautiful and untouristic. And then, of course, there is Gimmelwald, which is a very, very special place, and also to quite a lot of students who've been there with us over the years. Walter, who was in charge of the hotel, died last year, so it may never be the same again, but it's a little mountain village with no cars, with the most wonderful view across the valley of the big mountains and the snow, and then there are cows and cowbells and butterflies, which I miss a lot nowadays, and wildflowers. So that is that. Unfortunately, those are not the easiest places to get to. But if I'm in Europe, that's where I want to go. France, I've always been desperately keen on, rural France, and one of the French bread is my favourite thing to eat, and I've decided I can eat it without it killing me.
And that's because you're a celiac.
having been to Italy so many times over the last years, that's my one complaint, that I haven't been in France enough. I think the French way of life is lovely. I like the idea of carrying lots of loaves of bread on the back of a bicycle, etc. So that's the continent. Sri Lanka is very special. Lots of memories of our trips there and of our friends there and of the tragedy there, the tsunami. But I would like to go back there once more, although I'm told it's coming more and more under Chinese influence. And then we come to England itself, and Bath is very hard to beat. And if any of you haven't been to Bath, you've made a great mistake. You don't have to be invited, you just have to come, because we have a house there. And that's the one thing I'm really sad about this summer, apart from anything else, is that we are here and not there. And then there is the Lake District, and that is perfect for walking, and we have a special place, a youth hostel, where again, a fair number of students have been over the years, which is in the middle of nowhere and where you can walk in every direction, over hills and dales, and there are all these lovely sheep. Not too many tourists, though, I'm told, this year, when all the tourists are staying in their home countries, that it's overrun by tourists who may actually spoil it a bit. And I think that is my list. One nice thing about trips is going with people and seeing how they enjoy what you may already know, and it's new for them, and there's a sense of wonder, and you can recapture a bit of that when you go with other people.
Well, what an interesting conversation. It's funny, I sit beside you on the sofa at home, and we don't sit down and have these kinds of conversations very often, so I've enjoyed it, and I hope everyone else has. I think you have a grand finale that we will close on.
It's a finale, it's not very grand, and I'm finding it hard to recapture the tune from the first verse. Some folks put much reliance on politics and science, but there's only one hero for me. His praise we should be roaring, the man who first thought of pouring the first boiling water onto tea.
Bravo!